The Eternal Kingdom, a Chronicle of Ancient Egypt. For over 3,000 years, ancient Egypt rose as the world's longest-lasting empire, taming the mighty Nile, raising pyramids that touched the sky, and ruling as living gods. Yet even this seemingly eternal civilization could not escape the slow, relentless forces of nature, ambition, and time that finally brought it crashing down forever. The sun rises over a land that has stood for 3,000 years. The pyramids pierce the horizon like monuments to infinity itself. The Nile flows as it always has, bringing life to the desert, sustaining millions. Temples stretch toward the heavens, their walls covered in hieroglyphs proclaiming the eternal nature of the Pharaohs, the divine kings who bridge the mortal world and the realm of the gods. This is Egypt at its zenith, a civilization so ancient that even the Romans will one day call it old, a kingdom so enduring that it will outlast empires that haven't yet been imagined. But nothing lasts forever, not even eternity. The priests perform their rituals as they have for millennia. The scribes record the deeds of pharaohs in sacred script. The farmers work the black soil of the Nile's gift as their ancestors did before them, and their ancestors before them. But something is different now. The empire is hollow. Foreign powers circle like vultures. The throne passes between weak hands and foreign conquerors. The old certainties are crumbling. Soon, very soon, a Roman general will stand in Alexandria and Egypt. The Eternal Kingdom will become a province. The age of the pharaohs will end not with thunder, but with the quiet closing of a tomb door. 3,000 years of continuous civilization about to become memory. But how did it come to this? How does eternity end? To understand the fall, we must return to the beginning, to a time before Egypt was Egypt, before the pyramids, before the pharaohs, before the very concept of kingdom and empire took form in the human mind. We must go back to the desert, to the river, to the first people who looked at the fertile strip of land along the Nile and saw not just survival, but possibility. 10,000 years ago, the Sahara was not the vast desert it is today. Rain fell. Grasslands stretched where now only sand exists. Hunter-gatherers roamed freely, following herds gathering what the land provided. But the climate was changing. The rains were failing. The grasslands were dying. The people were being pushed toward the one constant in this transforming world, the Nile River, a ribbon of life cutting through increasingly hostile terrain. The Nile was different from other rivers. It flooded predictably, reliably, transforming the landscape each year with a precision that seemed almost divine. While other ancient peoples had to pray for rain and hope for the best, the people gathering along the Nile could depend on the annual inundation with almost complete certainty. This predictability changed everything. It allowed planning. It rewarded patience. It made agriculture not just possible, but extraordinarily productive. The floodwaters would arrive each summer, deposited rich black silt across the land, then recede, leaving behind soil so fertile that seeds almost seemed to plant themselves. The Egyptians would later call their land Kemet, the Black Land, referring to this precious dark soil that made life possible. Beyond the narrow strip watered by the Nile lay the Red Land, the desert, lifeless and hostile, a barrier that would protect Egypt even as it isolated it. By 6,000 years ago, villages were forming along the river. These weren't temporary camps, but permanent settlements. Mud brick homes, storage facilities for grain, the beginnings of social hierarchy. Some people were better at organizing labor. Others accumulated more resources. Inequality emerged, as it always does when surplus exists. With surplus came specialization. Not everyone needed to farm. Some could focus on crafts, on trade, on warfare, on the emerging rituals that would become the foundation of Egyptian religion. The villages became towns. The towns began to cluster into larger political units. Upper Egypt, the southern region where the Nile flowed through a narrow valley between desert cliffs. Lower Egypt, the northern delta, where the river spread into multiple channels before reaching the sea. Two lands, developing separately, with their own local rulers, their own gods, their own identities. Competition between them was inevitable. Violence was common. Warfare was becoming organized. Leaders were becoming kings. Around 5,000 years ago, the pace of the change accelerated. Hieroglyphic writing was emerging, developing from simple pictograms into a complex system capable of expressing abstract thought. Monumental architecture was beginning, not yet the pyramids, but impressive structures nonetheless. Trade networks were expanding, bringing exotic materials from distant lands. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, cedar from Lebanon, gold from Nubia. Egypt was connecting to the wider world even as it remained fundamentally shaped by its unique geography. Then came unification. The historical details are murky, lost in the mists of time and later mythology, but the result was clear. Around 3,100 years before the Common Era, Upper Egypt conquered Lower Egypt. A king named Narmer, or perhaps Menes, the historical record conflates them, united the two lands under a single crown. The Narmer palette, a ceremonial stone tablet, shows this king wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt on one side and the red crown of Lower Egypt on the other, smiting his enemies, establishing order from chaos. This wasn't just conquest. This was the creation of the world's first nation-state, a unified kingdom stretching hundreds of miles along the Nile, with a centralized administration, a divine king, an ideology that would prove remarkably durable. The early dynastic period established the patterns that would define Egypt for the next 3 millennia. The king was not just a political leader, but a god incarnate, the earthly embodiment of Horus, the falcon deity responsible for maintaining Ma'at, cosmic order and justice. When the king died, he became Osiris, lord of the underworld, and the new king became Horus. This divine kingship justified absolute power while simultaneously constraining it with religious obligation. The pharaoh wasn't free to do as he pleased. He had cosmic responsibilities. He had to maintain Ma'at. He had to ensure the Nile flooded. He had to keep chaos at bay. Memphis was established as the capital, strategically located at the junction between Upper and Lower Egypt, a deliberate choice that symbolized unity. From Memphis, the early pharaohs organized the kingdom, dividing it into administrative districts called nomes, each governed by a nomarch, a local official responsible to the king. They developed a sophisticated bureaucracy of scribes who recorded everything: grain harvests, tax collections, royal decrees, all written in hieroglyphs on papyrus, a writing material made from reeds that grew abundantly in the Nile marshes. The kings of the early dynastic period were buried in elaborate tombs at Abydos and Saqqara. These weren't yet pyramids, but mastabas, rectangular structures with sloping sides containing chambers for the king's body and the goods he would need in the afterlife. The Egyptians had developed a complex belief in the afterlife that would become central to their civilization. Death was not an end, but a transition. The body had to be preserved. The Ka, the life force, had to be sustained with offerings. The Ba, the personality, had to be able to travel between the tomb and the land of the living. These beliefs would drive the incredible investment in funerary architecture that defined Egyptian culture. Then came the Old Kingdom, the age of pyramids, the period when Egyptian civilization reached a creative peak that would never quite be matched again. The Third Dynasty began around 2,660 years before the Common Era, and with it came Djoser, a pharaoh remembered primarily for one achievement. His architect, Imhotep, a commoner elevated to legend, designed something revolutionary. At Saqqara, Imhotep constructed a tomb unlike anything seen before. He stacked mastabas on top of each other, each level smaller than the one below, creating a step pyramid. The step pyramid of Djoser rose in 6 stages to a height of over 200 feet, dominating the landscape, visible for miles across the desert. It was surrounded by a massive complex of courtyards, temples, and ceremonial buildings, all enclosed by a wall. This was more than a tomb. This was a statement about the power and permanence of kingship. Imhotep's innovation sparked an architectural revolution. Subsequent pharaohs wanted their own pyramids, each trying to outdo their predecessors. The 4th dynasty, beginning around 2,600 years before the Common Era, saw this competition reach its apex. Pharaoh Sneferu, the dynasty's founder, built not one but multiple pyramids as he experimented with the form. The bent pyramid at Dashur has a distinctive profile where the angle of the sides changes partway up, likely because the original angle proved structurally unstable. Undeterred, Sneferu built another pyramid nearby, the Red Pyramid, which succeeded in achieving smooth sides from base to apex. This was the first true pyramid. But Sneferu's son would eclipse even these achievements. Khufu, known to the Greeks as Cheops, decided to build the largest, most precise, most ambitious structure ever attempted by human hands. The Great Pyramid at Giza would consume his entire reign and the labor of tens of thousands of workers. Modern calculations estimate that the Great Pyramid contains approximately 2,300,000 stone blocks, each weighing an average of 2.5 tons. The pyramid originally stood 481 feet tall, making it the tallest human-made structure on Earth, a record it would hold for nearly 4,000 years. The precision is staggering. The base is almost perfectly level, with a maximum deviation of just over half an inch across a perimeter of over 3,000 feet. The sides are aligned to the cardinal directions with remarkable accuracy. The blocks are fitted together so tightly that even today you cannot fit a knife blade between many of them. This was achieved without iron tools, without wheels for transport, without pulleys, with only copper tools, stone hammers, wooden sledges, and an incredibly sophisticated understanding of engineering and organization. The logistics alone are mind-boggling. Limestone blocks were quarried nearby and dragged up ramps to their positions. Granite blocks for the burial chamber were brought from quarries 500 miles upriver at Aswan, transported on barges during the flood season when the Nile was high. The outer casing stones, fine white limestone from quarries across the river, were fitted last, creating smooth, reflective sides that gleamed in the sunlight. The ancient Egyptians called it Akhet Khufu, the horizon of Khufu, and indeed it must have seemed like the pyramid touched the sky itself. Who built this marvel? Not slaves, despite popular mythology. Recent archaeological discoveries at workers' villages near Giza reveal that the pyramid builders were paid laborers, Egyptian citizens, performing what was likely considered both a religious duty and a source of national pride. They lived in purpose-built settlements, received rations of bread and beer, had access to medical care, and were buried with respect in worker cemeteries. The notion that this was forced labor is largely a modern misconception influenced by biblical narratives that actually refer to a much later period. Khufu's pyramid was joined by those of his successors. His son Khafre built a pyramid almost as large, though on slightly higher ground so it appears taller. Khafre also constructed the Great Sphinx, a massive limestone statue with the body of a lion and the head of a king, probably representing Khafre himself, though this is debated. The Sphinx is carved from a natural limestone outcrop and stands 66 feet high, 240 feet long, gazing eternally toward the east, toward the rising sun. Menkaure, Khafre's successor, built the third and smallest of the Great Pyramids at Giza, along with 3 small pyramids for queens. The pyramid complex at Giza represents the pinnacle of Old Kingdom achievement, but it also represents an economy pushed to its absolute limit. The resources required for these projects were immense. Limestone and granite don't quarry themselves. Workers need to be fed, housed, and organized. The bureaucracy needed to coordinate these efforts had to be massive and efficient. The Egyptian state during the Old Kingdom became extraordinarily centralized, with nearly all power and resources flowing through the pharaoh. This centralization worked brilliantly when strong pharaohs occupied the throne. Pharaohs like Khufu, who could command absolute loyalty and organize labor on a scale that seems impossible even today. But it created vulnerabilities. The entire system depended on a functioning central authority. It depended on the Nile flooding predictably. It depended on the provinces sending their taxes to the capital. It depended on the ideology of divine kingship remaining unchallenged. After the 4th dynasty, the pyramids became smaller. The 5th and 6th dynasties continued building pyramids, but they lacked the scale and precision of the Giza giants. Resources were being diverted elsewhere, particularly to sun temples, reflecting a growing emphasis on the sun god Ra. The bureaucracy was expanding, becoming more complex but also more unwieldy. Provincial governors, the nomarchs, were accumulating power and wealth, becoming hereditary positions rather than royal appointments. The provinces were slowly becoming semi-independent. The Old Kingdom lasted from approximately 2,686 to 2,181 years before the Common Era, but by the end of the 6th dynasty, cracks were showing. The reign of Pepi II, who supposedly ruled for 94 years, the longest reign in history if the ancient sources are accurate, saw the gradual erosion of central authority. Whether Pepi really lived that long is questionable, but even if he only reigned half that time, the effect was the same. He outlived his designated heirs. The succession became unclear. Rival claims to the throne emerged. More fundamentally, the climate was changing. The Nile floods, so reliable for millennia, were becoming erratic. Some years the flood was too low, leaving insufficient water for crops. Other years, it came too high, destroying irrigation works and villages. Famine became recurring. The central government, its authority already weakening, could not respond effectively. Tax revenue declined as agricultural productivity fell. The king could no longer afford to maintain the bureaucracy. Local governors increasingly kept resources for themselves rather than sending them to Memphis. Then, the Old Kingdom collapsed. The transition wasn't a single dramatic event, but a gradual dissolution. Royal authority crumbled. The provinces became independent kingdoms in all but name. The carefully maintained ideology of divine kingship that had united Egypt for 500 years simply stopped functioning. Local officials declared themselves kings. Egypt fragmented into competing power centers. This period, known as the First Intermediate Period, lasting from approximately 2,181 to 2,055 years before the Common Era, was a time of chaos in Egyptian historical memory. Later Egyptian texts describe it as a time when Ma'at was overthrown, when the natural order was reversed, when servants became masters and the wealthy were dispossessed. The admonitions of Ippur, a literary text probably composed later but purporting to describe this period, paints a vivid picture of societal collapse. The poor have become rich. The rich have become beggars. Foreigners have entered Egypt from all sides. The great house, meaning the palace, has fallen. The king has been overthrown by the mob. How much of this reflects literal historical truth versus literary exaggeration is unclear. Egyptian literatures tended toward hyperbole when describing disorder. But the archaeological evidence confirms that this was indeed a time of fragmentation. Large-scale building projects ceased. The quality of artifacts declined. Egypt divided primarily between two competing power centers, Heracleopolis in the north and Thebes in the south, each claiming to be the legitimate continuation of Egyptian kingship, each unable to control the entire country. The first intermediate period was also a time of cultural innovation, though the Egyptians themselves would never have described it that way. With the collapse of royal monopoly on religious practices, ideas that had been restricted to the elite became democratized. The pyramid texts, magical spells inscribed inside royal pyramids to ensure the king's successful journey to the afterlife, were adapted and became available to non-royal individuals who could afford them. These would evolve into the coffin texts of the Middle Kingdom and eventually the Book of the Dead. The concept of the afterlife was no longer reserved for the god-king alone. Anyone with the means could aspire to immortality. Reunification came from Thebes. The rulers of this southern city gradually extended their control northward, conquering rival kingdoms, until finally, around 2,055 years before the Common Era, Mentuhotep II completed the reconquest, defeated the last Heracleopolitan kings, and once again united Egypt under a single crown. The Middle Kingdom had begun. The Middle Kingdom, lasting from approximately 2,055 to 1,750 years before the Common Era, represented a renaissance. Egypt was whole again. Central authority was restored. Large-scale building projects resumed. But this was not simply a return to the Old Kingdom. The trauma of fragmentation had changed Egyptian culture in fundamental ways. The pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom could not take their authority for granted as the Old Kingdom rulers had. They had to actively demonstrate competence and benevolence. They had to prove they deserved to rule. Literature from the Middle Kingdom reflects this changed dynamic. The tale of Sinuhe, one of the masterpieces of Egyptian literature, tells the story of a court official who flees Egypt following the death of his pharaoh, lives for years in exile in Syria, Palestine, achieves great success there, but ultimately yearns to return home and be buried in Egypt. The story emphasizes the pharaoh's mercy and wisdom when he allows Sinuhe to return. This is propaganda, certainly, but it's propaganda that has to work by persuasion, rather than simply asserting divine authority. The pharaoh in Sinuhe is portrayed as just and compassionate, qualities that have to be demonstrated, not just claimed. The Middle Kingdom pharaohs also took a more active role in economic development. The 12th dynasty in particular, roughly 1991 to 1782 years before the Common Era, saw ambitious projects to expand agricultural land. The Fayum, a natural depression southwest of Memphis fed by a channel from the Nile, was developed through irrigation projects into a rich agricultural region. Amenemhat III constructed a massive structure at Hawara that Greek visitors would later call the Labyrinth, describing it as exceeding even the pyramids in wonder, though unfortunately it has not survived. Foreign policy became more systematic. Lower Nubia was conquered and fortified. A series of massive mud brick fortresses were built along the Nile south of the First Cataract, imposing structures designed to control trade routes and prevent Nubian raids. These fortresses were engineering marvels in their own right, with thick walls, complex layouts, and defensive features that suggest military architecture was becoming a sophisticated discipline. Egypt was not content to remain isolated. It needed resources from the south, gold from Nubia, exotic goods from deeper into Africa, and it was willing to use military force to secure them. Trade networks extended north as well. Egyptian artifacts from this period have been found throughout Syria, Palestine, and the Levant. Egyptian literature references the rulers of foreign lands, local petty kings in these regions with whom Egypt maintained sometimes peaceful, sometimes hostile relationships. Egypt was engaging with the wider Near Eastern world in ways it hadn't during the Old Kingdom, when the kingdom had been more insular, more convinced of its own unique centrality. But the Middle Kingdom, like the Old Kingdom before it, began to weaken. The 13th dynasty, following the 12th, saw a rapid succession of short-reigning pharaohs. The king lists from this period show pharaoh after pharaoh, each ruling only a few years before being replaced. This instability suggests political infighting, powerful factions at court competing for the throne, possibly weak hereditary claims creating opportunities for rival claimants. The central government's grip on the provinces was loosening again. Local officials were once more becoming semi-independent. Into this power vacuum came foreigners. The Hyksos, a Semitic people from the Levant, had been migrating into the eastern Nile Delta for generations, peacefully at first, settling in communities engaging in trade. But as Egyptian central authority weakened, the Hyksos increasingly asserted independence. Around 1750 years before the Common Era, they established their own dynasty, the 15th dynasty, ruling from their capital at Avaris in the Delta. For the first time in Egyptian history, significant portions of Egypt were under foreign rule. The Hyksos period, part of what Egyptians called the Second Intermediate Period, was another time of fragmentation. Native Egyptian dynasties continued to rule from Thebes in the south, but they controlled far less territory than their Middle Kingdom predecessors. The Hyksos dominated the north and much of Middle Egypt. Nubian kingdoms to the south took advantage of Egyptian weakness to reassert their independence and even raid Egyptian territory. Later, Egyptian historical memory would demonize the Hyksos, portraying them as barbaric invaders who destroyed temples and ruled tyrannically. In reality, the Hyksos adopted Egyptian culture quite thoroughly, used Egyptian royal titles, worshipped Egyptian gods alongside their own Semitic deities, and maintained Egyptian administrative practices. They were not destroyers of Egyptian civilization, but a foreign dynasty, ruling within Egyptian cultural frameworks. Nevertheless, their presence was intolerable to the Theban rulers in the south, who saw themselves as the legitimate pharaohs of all Egypt. Around 1700 years before the Common Era, the Thebans began a war of reunification. Seqenenre-Tao, a Theban king, began the conflict, and his mummy shows evidence of violent death, his skull bearing wounds from Hyksos-style battle axes. His son, Kamose, continued the war, driving north, recapturing Egyptian territory. But it was Kamose's younger brother, or possibly nephew, Ahmose of the Mares, who finally succeeded. Around 1550 years before the Common Era, Ahmose captured Avaris, expelled the Hyksos from Egypt, pursued them into southern Palestine to ensure they could not regroup, and once again unified Egypt under Theban rule. The new kingdom had begun, and Egypt would never be the same. The new kingdom, lasting from approximately 1550 to 1077 years before the Common Era, represents Egypt at its most powerful, its most aggressive, its most imperial. The trauma of the Hyksos occupation had shattered the old Egyptian worldview. Egypt could no longer afford to be passive, relying on the desert and the sea to protect it. Egypt had to be proactive. Egypt had to control its neighbors before they could threaten it. The pharaohs of the 18th dynasty launched repeated military campaigns into the Levant. Thutmose I campaigned all the way to the Euphrates River, setting up a victory stela to mark the northern extent of Egyptian power. His grandson Thutmose III, who would become known as the Napoleon of ancient Egypt, conducted 17 campaigns into Syria-Palestine over 20 years, creating an Egyptian empire that stretched from the Fourth Cataract of the Nile in Nubia to the Euphrates in Syria. The Battle of Megiddo, fought around 1457 years before the Common Era, shows how sophisticated Egyptian military organization had become. A coalition of Canaanite city-states, supported by the Kingdom of Mitanni, a Hurrian power in northern Mesopotamia, gathered at Megiddo to resist Egyptian expansion. Thutmose III faced a strategic choice. The direct route to Megiddo went through a narrow mountain pass where his army would be vulnerable to ambush. His generals advised taking a longer but safer route. Thutmose rejected this advice. He would take the dangerous direct route because the enemy would not expect it. The gamble worked. The Egyptian army passed through the narrow defile without being attacked. the enemy forces had positioned themselves to defend the other routes. When Thutmose's army emerged from the pass and arrayed for battle, the coalition forces were caught off guard, their defensive positions useless. The battle was decisive. The coalition army broke and fled back into the fortified city. Thutmose laid siege to Megiddo, eventually forcing its surrender. The captured city yielded incredible plunder, hundreds of chariots, thousands of weapons, and more importantly, the submission of Canaanite rulers who now acknowledged Egyptian overlordship. Egyptian imperialism was not like later European colonialism. Egypt did not generally replace local rulers or impose direct administration. Instead, local kings remained on their thrones but had to swear loyalty to Pharaoh, pay tribute, and provide military support when required. Egyptian officials, called messengers or envoys, traveled throughout the empire ensuring compliance. Local rulers sent their sons to be educated at the Egyptian court, where they learned Egyptian language and customs, and served as hostages to ensure their father's loyalty. When these sons eventually inherited their father's thrones, they were thoroughly Egyptianized, making Egyptian cultural hegemony self-perpetuating. The wealth flowing into Egypt from this empire was staggering. Gold from Nubia, where Egyptian control extended further south than ever before. Timber from Lebanon, copper from Cyprus and Sinai, tribute from Syrian cities, trade goods from across the Near East. Egypt in the New Kingdom became perhaps the wealthiest state in the world, and that wealth was displayed ostentatiously. The capital was moved from Memphis to Thebes in Upper Egypt, home of the dynasty that had expelled the Hyksos and reunified Egypt. Thebes became the greatest city in Egypt, probably in the world. On the east bank of the Nile, the temples of Karnak and Luxor grew through continuous construction by successive pharaohs, each adding pylons, courts, halls, and obelisks. The Temple of Karnak eventually became the largest religious structure ever built, a vast complex covering over 200 acres. On the west bank lay the Valley of the Kings, a desolate wadi where New Kingdom pharaohs cut their tombs deep into the living rock, abandoning the pyramid tradition for hidden underground sepulchres. This shift reflected both practical concerns about tomb robbery, which had become endemic, and changing religious ideas. The tomb didn't need to be visible, it just needed to be secure. The mortuary temples where offerings would be made to the deceased king's spirit were built separately, impressive structures along the edge of the desert. The wealth and power of New Kingdom Egypt is exemplified by Amenhotep III, who reigned around 1400 to 1362 years before the Common Era at the empire's zenith. Amenhotep inherited an empire at peace, secured by his predecessor's military campaigns. He conducted few military expeditions himself, instead focusing on diplomacy and monumental construction. His mortuary temple on the Theban West Bank was the largest ever built, though today only the two massive seated statues, the Colossi of Memnon, remain standing. He massively expanded the Temple of Karnak. He built a vast palace complex at Malkata. He married a commoner named Tieo as his great royal wife, a choice that broke with tradition but demonstrated that a confident pharaoh could do as he pleased. Amenhotep III conducted extensive diplomatic correspondence with other Near Eastern powers, and some of this correspondence has been preserved in the Amarna letters, diplomatic archives discovered at the short-lived capital of his son. These letters reveal a world where Egypt was one great power among several. The Hittite Empire in Anatolia, the Kingdom of Mitanni in northern Mesopotamia, the Babylonian and Assyrian kingdoms in Mesopotamia proper, and Egypt treated each other as equals, at least in diplomatic language. They addressed each other as brothers. They exchanged royal women in marriage alliances. They sent lavish gifts. They also spied on each other, competed for influence over smaller states, and sometimes went to war. Then came one of the strangest episodes in Egyptian history. Amenhotep III's son, who took the name Amenhotep IV, became pharaoh around 1352 years before the Common Era and proceeded to overturn Egyptian religion. Egypt had always been polytheistic, with a vast pantheon of gods. The sun god Ra or Re was important, certainly, but so were Osiris, Isis, Horus, Ptah, Hathor, and hundreds of others. Local gods were worshipped in cities throughout Egypt. The priesthood, especially the priesthood of Amun-Ra at Thebes, had become incredibly wealthy and powerful. Amenhotep IV rejected this entire system. He declared that only one god truly existed, the Aten, the disk of the sun. All other gods were false. Their temples were closed. Their names were erased from monuments. Amenhotep changed his own name to Akhenaten, meaning effective for the Aten. He built a new capital city at a virgin site in Middle Egypt, a place with no previous religious associations, and named it Akhetaten, the horizon of the Aten. Today, we call it Amarna. Akhenaten's revolution was not just religious but artistic. Traditional Egyptian art was highly conservative, following conventions established in the Old Kingdom. Akhenaten's artists broke these rules. The king and his family were depicted in a radically new style: elongated skulls, swelling bellies, feminine hips. Whether this represented reality or symbolism is debated, but it was certainly different. The royal family was shown in intimate domestic scenes, Akhenaten and his wife Nefertiti playing with their daughters, a degree of informality unheard of in royal iconography. But Akhenaten's revolution failed. The reasons are complex. The Egyptian people never accepted Atenism. The traditional gods were too deeply embedded in Egyptian culture. The priesthoods, stripped of their power and wealth, actively resisted. The move to Amarna removed the king from the traditional administrative centers, weakening royal control. Most damaging, Akhenaten seems to have neglected foreign policy. The Amarna letters show vassal kings in Syria-Palestine desperately writing to Pharaoh, begging for military support against rival rulers or the expanding Hittite Empire, and the responses are inadequate or absent. Egyptian influence in the Levant was collapsing while Akhenaten focused on his religious vision. When Akhenaten died around 1336 years before the Common Era, the reaction was swift. His young son, originally named Tutankhaten, changed his name to Tutankhamun, restoring the god Amun to his name. The court abandoned Amarna and returned to Thebes. The temples of the traditional gods were reopened. Atenism was declared heresy. Akhenaten's monuments were defaced. His name was stricken from the king lists. Later generations would refer to him, if they referred to him at all, as that criminal of Akhetaten. Tutankhamun himself died young, around 18 years old after a brief reign. He is famous today only because his tomb, discovered in 1922 by Howard Carter, was found nearly intact, its treasures providing an unparalleled glimpse into Egyptian royal burial practices. But in his own time, Tutankhamun was relatively insignificant, a boy king controlled by powerful advisors who restored the old order. The 18th dynasty ended in confusion. An elderly official named A briefly took the throne, then power passed to Horemheb, a military commander who had served under Tutankhamun. Horemheb had no royal blood but took the throne through force of personality and military backing. He spent his reign completing the erasure of Akhenaten's memory and restoring Egypt's traditional institutions. When he died without an heir, he designated another military man, Ramesses, as his successor, establishing the 19th dynasty. The 19th dynasty would see Egypt regain its imperial power, but also face challenges that would ultimately prove insurmountable. Ramesses reigned briefly, establishing the dynasty's legitimacy. His son Seti the Fernfurnace campaigned vigorously in Syria-Palestine, reasserting Egyptian authority that had weakened during the Amarna period. But it was Seti's son, Ramesses II, who would become one of the most famous pharaohs in Egyptian history. Ramesses II reigned for 67 years, from approximately 1280 to 1213 years before the Common Era. He conducted numerous military campaigns, fought the Hittites for control of Syria, built more monuments than any other pharaoh, and fathered perhaps 100 children. His propaganda was everywhere, his names and titles carved on temples throughout Egypt, his massive statues dominating the landscape. The Great Temple at Abu Simbel in Nubia features 4 colossal seated statues of Ramesses, each 67 feet tall, carved directly from the cliff face. Inside, reliefs show Ramesses as a warrior king, defeating Egypt's enemies, maintaining cosmic order. The defining moment of Ramesses II's reign came early, the Battle of Kadesh, around 1274 years before the Common Era. Kadesh was a city in Syria contested between Egypt and the Hittite Empire. Ramesses marched north with 4 divisions, 20,000 men, to capture it. But Hittite king Muwatalli II had gathered a larger force and set a trap. Egyptian scouts captured 2 Bedouin who claimed the Hittite army was far to the north, still gathering. Ramesses believed them. He rushed forward with his lead division, leaving the others to follow. The Bedouin were enemy agents. The Hittite army was hidden near Kadesh. When Ramesses' lead division made camp, the Hittites attacked the 2nd Egyptian division while it was still on the march, scattering it. Panic spread. Ramesses found himself surrounded with only his personal guard. According to Egyptian accounts, Ramesses single-handedly fought his way through the Hittite lines, rallying his troops through personal courage until reinforcements arrived and the Hittites withdrew. Hittite accounts suggest a more ambiguous outcome. Both sides claimed victory. What's clear is that neither side achieved their objectives. The battle was essentially a draw, but from this military stalemate came something historically significant. After years of continued skirmishing, Ramesses II and the new Hittite king, Hattusili III, negotiated a peace treaty around 1259 years before the Common Era. The treaty established borders, required mutual defense against third parties, and provided for the extradition of fugitives. Most remarkably, copies of the treaty were made in both Egyptian hieroglyphics and Hittite cuneiform, and examples of both versions have been discovered, allowing us to confirm they are virtually identical. This is the earliest surviving international peace treaty, evidence that even in the Bronze Age, sophisticated diplomacy was possible. The peace with the Hittites allowed Egypt to focus on other concerns, particularly the growing threat of the Sea Peoples, mysterious raiders of uncertain origin who were destabilizing the entire eastern Mediterranean. Ramesses the Busagu's son and successor Merimta faced invasions from Libya supported by Sea Peoples contingents. He defeated them, but the threat did not disappear. The early 12th century before the Common Era saw a catastrophic wave of destructions across the Near East. The Hittite Empire collapsed entirely, its capital Hattusa destroyed. Mycenaean Greece fell into a dark age. Ugarit, a wealthy trading city in Syria, was destroyed and never rebuilt. Cyprus was devastated. The entire Bronze Age international system collapsed. Egypt survived this catastrophe, but barely. Ramesses III of the 20th dynasty, reigning around 1186 to 1155 years before the Common Era, faced massive invasions by land and sea. His mortuary temple at Medinet Habu contains detailed reliefs showing naval battles, enemy ships being destroyed, captives being taken. Ramesses III claimed great victories, and certainly Egypt was not conquered, but the effort exhausted the kingdom. The later years of his reign saw the first recorded labor strikes in history, royal tomb workers at Deir el-Medina who had not been paid staging sit-down protests. If the state could not even pay its workers, how stable could it really be? After Ramesses III, the new kingdom entered terminal decline. A series of weak pharaohs, all named Ramesses, the 4th through the 11th, reigned in increasingly rapid succession. Royal power fragmented. The high priests of Amun at Thebes became effectively independent rulers of Upper Egypt. Lower Egypt was controlled by pharaohs ruling from the delta city of Tanis. Nubia broke away, forming independent kingdoms. The Asiatic Empire was completely lost, Syria-Palestine falling under the control of new powers. Around 1077 years before the Common Era, the last pharaoh of the new kingdom died. The third intermediate period began, another era of fragmentation and foreign rule. Egypt would reunite again under Nubian pharaohs of the 25th dynasty, experience a final flourishing under the Saudi 26th dynasty, but the pattern was clear. Egypt could no longer maintain unity through its own strength alone. The era of Egyptian dominance was over. The reasons for this decline were complex. The Sea People's catastrophe and the collapse of the Bronze Age trading networks disrupted the international system Egypt had relied on. The empire in Syria-Palestine had provided wealth, but it also required constant military expeditioning to maintain, and eventually, the costs exceeded the benefits. Climate change may have played a role again, as it had in the collapse of the Old Kingdom and Middle Kingdom. Reduced Nile floods meant reduced agricultural productivity, reduced tax revenue, reduced state capacity. But there were internal factors as well. The priesthood of Amun had accumulated so much wealth and land that it rivaled the pharaoh's own resources. The religious establishment became a separate power base. The practice of rewarding military veterans with land grants created a class of military landholders whose loyalty was to their patron, not necessarily to the state. The bureaucracy became corrupt and inefficient, positions increasingly becoming hereditary sinecures rather than meritocratic appointments. Egypt, in the first millennium, before the Common Era, became a prize contested by outside powers. The Assyrian Empire invaded in the 7th century before the Common Era, sacking Thebes in 663 before being expelled. The Persian Empire conquered Egypt in 525 before the Common Era, ruling it as a province with Persian-appointed governors. The Egyptians rebelled repeatedly, temporarily regaining independence in the 4th century before the Common Era, but were reconquered by Persia. Then came Alexander the Great. In 332 before the Common Era, the young Macedonian king invaded Egypt with minimal resistance. The Egyptians, who hated Persian rule, welcomed Alexander as a liberator. He made the politically astute decision to present himself not as a foreign conqueror, but as a legitimate pharaoh. He traveled to the Oracle of Amun at the Siwa Oasis in the western desert, where the priests declared him the son of Amun, giving him divine legitimacy in Egyptian eyes. He founded the city of Alexandria on the Mediterranean coast, which would become one of the great cities of the ancient world. When Alexander died in 323 before the Common Era, his empire was divided among his generals. Ptolemy, one of Alexander's closest companions, took Egypt. Ptolemy I Soter established the Ptolemaic dynasty, which would rule Egypt for 300 years. The Ptolemies were Greek, spoke Greek, imported Greek settlers, patronized Greek culture. They built the Great Library of Alexandria, making the city a center of Hellenistic learning. They minted Greek-style coinage, organized the administration along Greek lines. But the Ptolemies also understood that to rule Egypt, they had to be Egyptian pharaohs. They supported traditional Egyptian temples, built new ones in traditional Egyptian style, and had themselves depicted in hieroglyphic inscriptions using traditional pharaonic titles and iconography. The Rosetta Stone, which would eventually unlock the ability to read hieroglyphics, is a Ptolemaic decree issued in 3 scripts: hieroglyphic for the priests, Demotic Egyptian for the people, Greek for the administration, symbolizing the hybrid nature of Ptolemaic rule. The Ptolemaic kingdom was initially powerful, controlling not just Egypt but also Cyprus, parts of Syria, and possessing influence throughout the eastern Mediterranean. But the Ptolemies repeated the old pattern. Dynastic infighting, civil wars between rival claimants to the throne weakened the kingdom. Ptolemaic power contracted. By the 2nd century, before the Common Era, Rome was rising in the Mediterranean, and Egypt was becoming a client state, nominally independent but actually dependent on Roman support. The last great struggle came in the 1st century, before the Common Era. Cleopatra VII, the most famous of the Ptolemaic rulers, tried to preserve Egyptian independence through alliance with powerful Romans. First, Julius Caesar, with whom she had a son, then Mark Antony, whom she married, and with whom she had 3 children. Cleopatra and Antony challenged Octavian, Caesar's heir, for control of the Roman world. At the naval battle of Actium in 31 before the Common Era, their forces were defeated. They fled to Alexandria. The next year, Octavian invaded Egypt. Antony committed suicide. Cleopatra attempted to negotiate with Octavian, but when it became clear he intended to parade her in chains through Rome as part of his triumph, she too committed suicide, dying by the bite of an asp, according to tradition. On August 1st, 30 years before the Common Era, Octavian entered Alexandria. Egypt became a province of Rome, but a special province. It was so wealthy, its grain production so crucial to feeding the city of Rome, that Octavian kept it under his personal control, forbidding Roman senators from even entering without his permission. Octavian, soon to be renamed Augustus, had himself depicted on Egyptian temples as pharaoh, maintaining the fiction of continuity, but everyone knew the truth. Egypt was conquered. The line of pharaohs stretching back 3,000 years to Narmer was broken. Roman Egypt was prosperous but subordinate. Egyptian grain fed Rome. Egyptian wealth enriched Rome. Egyptian culture fascinated Romans, who adopted Egyptian motifs, imported obelisks, developed mystery cults based on Isis and Osiris. But Egypt itself was no longer an independent civilization. When the Roman Empire later split, Egypt became part of the Byzantine Empire, Greek-speaking and Christian. In 641 of the Common Era, Arab Muslim armies conquered Egypt with barely a fight. The Byzantines were expelled. Egypt became part of the Islamic world, a transformation more profound than even the Roman conquest. The hieroglyphic script stopped being used. The last known hieroglyphic inscription dates to 394 of the Common Era, carved at the Temple of Isis at Philae. After that, the ability to read hieroglyphics was lost, the knowledge dying with the last priests. The ancient temples were abandoned, sometimes converted to churches or mosques, often simply left to the desert. The pyramids remained, too massive to destroy, but their meaning was forgotten. Medieval Arabs thought they were Joseph's granaries for storing wheat during the biblical famine. The Sphinx was vandalized, its nose chiseled off, though by whom and when is unknown. For over 1,000 years, ancient Egypt was lost, buried under sand, overbuilt by later cities, its texts unreadable, its history reduced to garbled legends. Not until Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in 1798, when French scholars accompanying the army began systematic study of the monuments, did Europe rediscover ancient Egypt. The discovery of the Rosetta Stone during that expedition and its eventual decipherment by Jean-François Champollion in 1822 finally allowed hieroglyphics to be read again. Archaeology in the 19th and 20th centuries slowly reconstructed ancient Egyptian history from the physical remains and texts. Today, we can walk through the temples of Karnak and Luxor, descend into the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, stand before the pyramids of Giza, and marvel at what the ancient Egyptians achieved. 3,000 years of continuous civilization, architectural accomplishments that still seem barely possible, a written language of incredible complexity and beauty, religious and philosophical ideas that influenced later civilizations profoundly. Egypt gave us the 365-day calendar. It gave us paper in the form of papyrus. It developed medicine to a sophistication unmatched until classical Greece. Its art and architecture influenced everyone who encountered it, from the Greeks and Romans to modern architects and artists. But Egypt also demonstrates the fundamental fragility of even the most powerful civilizations. Egypt seemed eternal to those who lived in it. The pyramids were already ancient when Cleopatra lived, older to her than she is to us. Egyptian ideology insisted on changelessness, on the permanence of Mayat, on the eternal nature of kingship. Yet Egypt fell. It fell multiple times, in fact, fragmenting and reunifying in a cycle that eventually ended with foreign conquest and cultural transformation. Why did Egypt fall? We can point to specific causes: climate change and Nile flood failures during the First and Second Intermediate periods, the Sea Peoples and the Bronze Age collapse that ended the New Kingdom, internal political decay, corrupt bureaucracies, overpowerful priesthoods, dynastic infighting, external pressures from rising powers, Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, Romans, the exhaustion of resources from maintaining empire, the challenge of maintaining cultural unity across vast geographic distances and long chronological spans. But perhaps the deeper answer is that nothing lasts forever, that entropy applies to civilizations as to everything else, that the very factors that make a civilization successful in one era can become liabilities in changed circumstances. Egypt's geography protected it, but also isolated it. When the world became more interconnected, when chariot warfare, and later cavalry, and siege engines and professional armies made the desert less of a barrier, Egypt's isolation became vulnerability. Egypt's ideology of divine kingship created strong central authority, but made the entire system dependent on having strong pharaohs. When weak rulers inherited the throne, as eventually they always did, the system faltered. Egypt's investment in monumental architecture and elaborate religious practices created cultural continuity and social cohesion, but absorbed resources that might have been invested in military modernization or economic development. The ultimate lesson of Egypt is one of impermanence. The civilization that seemed most likely to endure forever, that built in stone, that developed an ideology of eternity, that lasted longer than almost any other, still ended. The temples are ruins. The pyramids are empty shells, their treasures looted millennia ago, their religious significance forgotten. The language is dead, spoken by no one, readable only by scholars. The gods are no longer worshipped, their names known now only through archaeology. Yet, in another sense, Egypt endures. The monuments remain, weathered but standing. The mummies survive, allowing us to look into the faces of people who lived 3,000 years ago. The texts have been recovered and read, letting the ancient Egyptians speak across the millennia. Every time someone visits a museum and sees Egyptian artifacts, every time the pyramids appear in a photograph, every time someone references the pharaohs or hieroglyphics or mummies in popular culture, Egypt lives on. 3,000 years they built. 3,000 years they endured. Then they fell, as all empires fall, as all civilizations fall, as eventually our own civilization will fall. The Nile still flows, as it always has, bringing life to the desert. But the temples along its banks are silent. The priests are gone. The pharaohs are dust. The eternal kingdom has ended. And yet we remember. We study. We marvel. And perhaps that is its own kind of immortality. Not the physical eternity the Egyptians sought, preserving bodies, building in stone, inscribing names to last forever. But cultural immortality, living on in memory and influence, shaping civilizations that would come long after, echoing through millennia in ways the ancient Egyptians never anticipated. They built for eternity. Eternity defeated them. But memory preserves what stone could not. The eternal kingdom fell. The story endures.